There we go. Say it has been a while since we did this one.
Let's dance to a half-hour rhythm by Benny Goodman and his orchestra, the Raja Rhythm, playing for you
There we
from
go.
the Joseph Urban Room of the Congress Hotel in downtown Chicago. Dodging a divorcee, the first.
Oh, my.
Benny Goodman and his orchestra.
Hey, Marilyn. Hey, Kathleen, Lorena. Let me zip back a little bit here. Hey, Chris, Mary, Meg, Martin, Larry, Carol, Sarah, Lorena. Hey, Mona. Hey, Kathleen. And hey, Jeff. Lila's probably still on, so I'll... we don't actually start for about 10 more minutes yet anyway. So... Hey, Dad. Hey, grandkids galore. Over on YouTube. Hey, Mona. Hey, Bob. Hey, Lynn. Hey, Miles. You gonna hop up? Miles has been driving me crazy all evening. All evening long. Just driving me nuts. Hey, Kelly. Hey, Beth. He's been clawing me and clawing me. I'm going to try to get this light a little bit dimmer. One of those nights. It's just a little bit off. Hey, Evelyn. Miles, come on, hop up. Alexa, Tiffany Lamp 5. No. Hey, Mike. Hey, Karen. Hey, everybody. Welcome along. I know Layla's still going, so... Hey, Stacy. Hey, Gideon. Hillary. Alright, now this should work. No, wrong button. I'm hitting all the wrong buttons tonight. It is one of those nights. Hey. There. Alright. I feel better now. I feel like I'm still kind of blurry. So look out, guys. I'm about to do the swab thing. There we go. Hey, happy birthday, Susan. Hey, Jean Marine. Hey, we'll wait a while. We got a few minutes yet.
Perfectly alluded. Benny Goodman presents Helen Ward singing "The Day I Let You Get Away."
Hey, Stacy. 25 tomorrow. Okay. I could live with that after today. Today was really cold. Miles. Hey, ready to say hi? Ah, here's the guy. Oh. Miles wants to bug me but not be on camera. That's just perfect. Hey, Dave. Oh, my apartment is a mess. I can see it behind me now. Here we go, Miles. Here we go. Hopping on up. Here he goes. Here he is. Hey, Vicky. Hey, Gene over on Twitch. Hey, Laurie. Evening, Mom. Hey, Laurie. Miles. Aw. Hey, Octavio. Hope you all had a good time with Layla. But Miles. Yep. Hey, Miles. I gotta keep the camera steady here, okay? Here, bump into it like this. Alright. Keeping one eye on the Springsteen set list coming in. First E Street Band show in several years. Miles, knock it off. Laura, we'll fight the good fight. Tell the legislators the old road is rapidly aging and they can get the fuck off of the new one if they don't understand. Sorry, I'm not in the mood with Terps today. Miles' birthday is coming up in March. Javier.
Music by Benny Goodman and his orchestra. And the next tune, Sandman.
And Miles is just all over here today. Miles wants all the attention. Well, what's going to happen in a minute here, when I get started and we need him after the show? Where's he going to be then, huh? Miles, watch it. Hey, Nancy in Denver. Layla's now on questions. I'll give it a couple more minutes. I know a lot of people want to stick around with Layla, and I don't blame them one bit. Is there a full moon tonight? That would explain a lot if there was a full moon tonight. Miles. I know, okay, he's knocking the Bruce Springsteen record off of the wall. Maybe he's excited about the tour starting in Tampa tonight, too. Hey, Kathy in Arkansas. And hey, Don. I got Miles. Miles' tail is still all over my keyboard. Alright, if Layla has released you all, we'll get a couple more minutes. Hey, Gene. Miles, you are all over the place. Laura, you tell them. Our brothers and sisters and those beyond the binary. Which honestly is like half the people I know. So, hey, Tebby. I think we're all staying warm here. Miles is sure trying his best. What an angle we got there. Wow, that was like crap. Miles. I know I'm wearing crazy clothes, and I look pretty crappy sometimes. Way up. Alright, we're going to give everybody another minute or so, as I know a lot of people were at F in Chicago. Might need to grab a drink in between. Hey, Grandma Bell. Yeah, something is up. I mean, we've also had the upstairs cats have been howling at our door quite a bit. Jeff. You know, Kelly Marshall over at Chicago Movie Tours would know more about that than I do. Hey, Ed. Yeah, tomorrow is Groundhog Day. Maybe I should go do something for it. How far away is Woodstock from here, anyway? I've never been. AK Shoot Video over on YouTube. Hey, Julie. We're giving it a second for everybody to get on. Letting Benny finish up one more tune. Hi, alls. Miles, you're a silly cat. Kathleen, of course, they're both fixed. And Priya was on the couch a few minutes ago. Yeah, I think Woodstock is further away than I want to get. Miles, please stay off the keyboard. You could really mess me up. Hey, Gina. It's off. My alls, you are really going to mess me up. I gotta move. Welcome along, everybody. We're letting Benny Goodman finish up this tune. I know some people are still coming over from Layla's talk. Well, I kind of move around here as this cat will not give me a second. You see this guy? Miles is having a Martian fit, it would appear, as my grandfather used to call it. And suddenly you notice there's a Martian in the next room. I'll just set up here. Okay, Miles, Benny Goodman is wrapping up this song, which means it's time for us to start. All right, that was Helen Ward with Benny Goodman and his orchestra coming to you live from the Congress Hotel in downtown Chicago. Means that it is time for us to start properly. So welcome along, everybody. Welcome to my messy apartment. It's out of control right now. I'll try to get that in order tomorrow. Welcome along. I'm Adam from Mysterious Chicago Tours. I've been a tour guide and historian here in Chicago for going on 20 years now. Got about a dozen Chicago history books out, including Mysterious Chicago, the book, H.H. Holmes, The True History of the White City Devil, Smart Aleck's Guide to American History, Flickering Empire, How Chicago Invented the U.S. Film Industry. So, one thing I'm going to recommend tonight, though, besides some of my own books, I also want to recommend a book by Christopher Robert Reed, Black Chicago's First Century. It's a really excellent source, probably the best of the kind of things that I'm going to be talking about tonight, which is about the Underground Railroad, the kind of informal network to help people escape from slavery down south, up to freedom up north, or possibly in Canada, as the case may be. A lot of people got to Chicago and just set up here. Others were helped to get all the way to Canada. Now, finding actual data about this can be rather difficult. There's any number of buildings around the country where people say, oh, this was an Underground Railroad stop, or they'll find a hidden compartment and assume it was for hiding people who are running away. Sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not. It's very difficult to tell. This was an illegal operation for most of its existence, and as such, they had to be fairly secretive about it. Most of what survives comes from anecdotal evidence. There's this one great story that was published in 1848. There was a story, it's one of those old true tales, which is in quotes, so we should probably not consider it entirely true. But there was a story that went around. There was a guy by the name of Charlie who had been enslaved down south and escaped, came up to Illinois, then wrote back to his enslaver, said, could you please take me back? Like, no questions asked, no harm, no foul. If you do, I will tell everybody else on the plantation how good they have it here and why they shouldn't try to escape. So the enslaver said, sure, fine, no hard feelings. Come on back and tell them all of that. As soon as he got them out of talk, I was like, okay, so here's how you escape. This is the story here. Whether this is actually in fact true, and also this, even nowadays we would reading some of this sort of stuff, the fact that they're saying slave instead of enslaved person, which is now generally more common. Also, fine, athletic-looking creature. We would never use language like that nowadays. But that's the thing. A lot of this stuff is from vintage sources, and it evolves. Not to mention that a great many of the stories about these people that we have are not about the people escaping. It's more about the white people who helped them. This fits into what we call the white savior narrative. Now, there's been a lot of backlash about that over the last few years, and it's generally justified, though I do think that we've had a kind of a little bit of overcorrection, is you do occasionally hear that the abolitionists weren't really all that great, or they were just as bad as everybody else. But no, these people were in fact risking their lives, and many of them were very serious about what they did. So what we're going to do today is we're going to tell some of the stories we have, and most of them do fit that paradigm of being like a white savior narrative, because that's the data that we've got. We've got the data about the people who stuck around helping, people who made it to Canada. If everything went well, there probably wouldn't be a lot of stories surviving, that just being the nature of the thing. But just so we're aware of that before we get started, we're going to start back in the 1830s of Chicago. And of course, the easiest way to show some of these things is just to show the people's graves. This being stories from the mid-19th century. Of course, everybody involved in these stories is dead. So, this is the grave of a guy by the name of Philo Carpenter. This is a bust of Philo that was, I believe, at a church kind of by Union Park, but I don't know where it is anymore. It seems to have kind of vanished off of the record at some point. But this is a bust of Philo Carpenter, sculpted by Laredo Taft, the same guy who did the Eternal Silence statue here at Graceland Cemetery, just over the hill to the left of this one. Now, Philo Carpenter came to Chicago in the early 1830s. He traveled here by canoe because he heard it would be a good place, and set up as a pharmacist just in time for a whole troop full of sailors to show up, bringing cholera with them. Now, they were transported to Chicago by Captain Walker, who would later command the Great Western, which was well known as an Underground Railroad ship. Captain Walker was very willing not to notice that when he left Chicago, he suddenly had several more black crew members than he had when he arrived. He was also only too willing not to notice that when he left Detroit, he suddenly had far fewer black crew members than he had when he first showed up. This is just the way that he operated. He worked with Philo Carpenter quite a bit from what anecdotes we have. Carpenter was one of the founders of the Chicago Anti-Slavery Society, and even like years later, right up to the very end of when the Civil War began, he is still being credited with helping people escape. By one account, he had a whole farm up in the North Woods someplace where he would hide people out and give them shelter until the Great Western showed up and could take them to Canada. Now, once again, difficult to know for sure, but by all accounts, we got his name on plenty of paperwork. He was definitely involved in this. And I don't know why I stuck it out here. Now, he did have to go to Washington, D.C. one time. He actually met Andrew Jackson and would only comment, "I didn't vote for him." It's a good sentiment. Somewhere, for some reason, at this point of the deck, I also have my pictures of the statues of Jefferson Davis, Alexander Stevens, and Robert E. Lee, who is now no longer at the Capitol, so we can get rid of that one. This got me in a lot of trouble working for that company. I regret nothing. But let's move on into the city a bit. Round a little bit later than Philo Carpenter arrived, a guy by the name of Joseph Henry Hudlin came to town, and eventually built himself a house here on this corner by Dearborn and Plymouth, on Harrison and Plymouth. So right by Dearborn Station, where Dearborn Station is now. Now, Joseph Henry Hudlin was originally enslaved in Culpeper, Virginia. There are various accounts as to how exactly he escaped. The simplest one is that he was working on a ship, or found a ship that was leaving, put on a chef's hat, got on board the ship, and sailed along pretending to be a chef until the boat docked in Illinois, at which point he just left. Miles has moved over, so I can move back over to my usual spot, I guess. Now, here's where it gets very interesting to me, is at Graceland Cemetery, well, he made his way to Chicago and then spent years working as the janitor at the Board of Trade, but also working on the Underground Railroad. He had a brother in Alton, Illinois, set up by then. People who were escaping primarily from Missouri would make their way to Alton, Illinois. Joseph would meet them there and conduct them safely to Chicago, where they would either stay or get on a ship and head up to Canada. Now, here's where it gets kind of interesting to me. It's all interesting, but this is Joseph Hudlin's grave at Graceland Cemetery, or at least a grave marker for him. But this is not actually his grave. His grave, in fact, is just beyond that, and it's actually unmarked. There is just what is said to be a base for a monument in the paperwork for it. But let's go take another look. The paperwork also says that a woman by the name of Martha Stevens was originally buried in his family plot, or as Mary Ann Stevens, who you now see is right over here in the section where he is now. Now, Mary Ann Stevens was the mother of Martha Gray, who was over here. We don't know too much about them, except that they were a black mother and daughter who came to Chicago from St. Louis. So it's entirely possible that these are people that he had helped to escape. We know they must have been connected since he allowed Mary to be buried in his own family plot before that one could be purchased. Also, you see right next to him here is Willis Montgomery. There's a typo on this guy's gravestone. 1859 was not the year he was born specifically. It was the year that he came to Chicago. You might say it was the year he became free. He was actually about 30 years old by then. Willis Montgomery, again, not a lot is known about him, but he came up from Kentucky in the 1850s, was likely escaping from slavery himself, and worked as a barber for a long time. Exactly what his connection to Joseph Hudlin or the Stevens and Gray families would have been is not really known, but the most logical solution with all of this stuff is these might have been people that Joseph Hudlin helped to escape. And as a result, they decided to put a marker up for him adjacent to his own plot. For some reason, the family never got as far as putting up a marker to him. Now, getting an actual look of what he looked like, this picture on the left that I've had up the whole time is from the Chicago Defender. If you look up pictures of Joseph Hudlin, you'll get this one, this larger one of him in his uniform. Trouble is, I'm not 100% sure this is him. It might be Joseph Hudlin Jr., his son, who took over his job as janitor of the Board of Trade. Between the two of them, they had that job for something like 90 years between the two of them. Oh, hey, Caleb. Good to see you out there. We're going to move on a little bit here. Just to this space right here in the loop. And we'll go all the way back to 1842. In 1842, a guy by the name of Edwin Heathcock was arrested in Chicago on suspicion of being possibly an escaping slave, or an escaping enslaved person. One of his co-workers was jealous of him for some reason and turned him in as such, so they held him in jail for a bit, but nobody came to claim him as a person they enslaved, so he was eventually let go, but there was a rule saying that if you couldn't pay for your board in jail, you could be auctioned into up to a month of indentured servitude. Now, this isn't the same thing as chattel slavery, but it looked a little bit too close. So right here in this building, they had to have an auction for this. And you can see that people were rather riled up about this. This just looked a little bit too close. An unusual sight in a free state, a sale of a man to the highest bidder. So the anti-slavery community in Chicago had gotten together and made it known that nobody had better bid on this guy. And after a couple of attempts at an auction, the sheriff finally said, listen, if nobody bids, I have to put this guy back in jail. So out the window across the street looked Mollin Ogden. Mollin Ogden was the brother of William Ogden, our first mayor, a railroad millionaire. Miles just ran through the back over here. Miles, what is with you tonight? Okay. So Mollin Ogden looked out at this auction going on below him, held up a quarter, said, I bid 2 bits. And finally, the auctioneer said that immortal phrase, going, going, gone. Ogden walked up with his quarter, said, all right, I bid, you're my man, I say go where you like. And with that, for 25 cents, he effectively averted a riot. Now, there are 2 accounts of this that now survive. One of them, we'll take a quick look here at Mollin's grave at Graceland Cemetery. There are 2 accounts. There's an early one that acts like Mollin Ogden was a regular villain just for getting involved in this at all, for acknowledging that it was even happening. But then there was a later one that acted like he was a real hero for being the guy who stopped the riot for 25 cents. Now, the interesting thing about these 2 accounts is they are both written by the same guy. They are both written by Zabina Eastman, who is now over at Rose Hill Cemetery. I went through his papers at the History Museum a couple of months ago. Really some interesting stuff in there. He was a publisher of an anti-slavery newspaper called the Free West, or the Western Citizen. There's Zabina himself. Picture's going to disappear in a second. Now, going through the archives of his newspaper is now online. You can actually search the Free West now. I really need to go through it and update all of these stories, in fact. But when I was digging through the microfilm, I found this speech given at Princeton, Illinois by Frederick Douglass in 1853. And there were some great lines in there. I thought, man, this is a beast. I got to look this thing up later. Then I looked it up later and found out that it hadn't been transcribed anywhere else. It was effectively a lost speech. It had last seen the light of day in this newspaper. So it's up on the webpage now if you poke around for it at MysteriousChicago.com. It really is an excellent speech. The one line that Zabina Eastman himself later quoted was, when a slave is first running away, he would rather encounter a wolf than a Christian. Better a rattlesnake than a man with a prayer book under his arm. You can see also, that's also probably why this one didn't get repeated much. It was a great line, but the more middle of the road, more pragmatic abolitionists really hated it when he said stuff like that. This was really bad public relations for them. Now, there were people out there who were just as committed to anti-slavery ideals, but thought that you were more productive not doing stuff like that. I think it's a valid way of going about it. Though, of course, looking back now, we tend to admire more the people who are more firebrands about all of this, such as Charles Volney Dyer, who was sometimes, thank you, I'm actually, that's either Mandy or Layla posting from effing Chicago. Right over here, Oakwood Cemetery on the south side, on what I believe was originally his land. Charles Volney Dyer. I love talking about Charles Volney Dyer. Here's a shot of him. So Charles Volney Dyer came to Chicago initially as a surgeon. He was one of two men who dissected the body of our first executed murderer, John Stone, in 1840. But after a while, he was making so much in real estate that he stopped working in medicine and spent more of his time focusing on his work on the Underground Railroad. He was sometimes referred to as the president of the Underground Railroad, helped countless people escape over the years. So we're going to pop into the loop for a second. Right where City Hall is now was his office. One day he was in his office having some breakfast, as one does, when one of his clerks came running in saying, "Sir, there are slave catchers in town. They helped that man. They've got that man you were hiding. They've taken him into the Mansion House Hotel." So Dr. Dyer said, we'll see about that, and ran all the way to the Mansion House. We'll retrace his route right here. It was only a couple of blocks away down to Lake Street. This is probably the exact route he would have taken. Then the Mansion House, we'll slow down a bit from there. But yeah, really it would have been just under the L tracks. Right around in here. So he came into where these slave catchers had kidnapped a guy that he was trying to help escape from slavery, busted into their room brandishing his cane, and they said, "You, sir, are interfering with our domestic institutions." To which Dyer reportedly said, "Well, you are interfering with my breakfast," at which point he busted his cane over the guy's head and proceeded to unkidnap the person he had been trying to help. Now, it's difficult to imagine that it exactly went down like this, so much like an action movie or something, with that kind of witty repartee. However, it was widely reported very close to the time that it actually happened, and certainly the cane was broken in the affray. Eventually, some people got together and got Dr. Dyer a new cane to replace the one that he had broken over a slave catcher's head. The new one was eventually presented to the Historical Society. They've still got it. They don't take it out of storage much. I've been trying to get him. We got to talk more about this guy. Such an interesting character. You can go on and on with stories about Charles Volney Dyer. He comes up in my tours a lot, and always for completely different reasons and completely different stories. It's a guy who led a life I think he can probably be proud of, but also definitely a cantankerous guy. There are also plenty of lawsuits against him for times when he lost his temper. Let's move on. The link was suspicious, the one that's going to the Frederick Douglass speech. Is Facebook operating out of Florida or Texas now? But just where the Chicago Title Building is now was the law office of LCP Freer. LCP Freer, and for a time James Collins as well. We'll check out Mr. Freer here a second over at Graceland Cemetery. Mr. and Mrs. Freer. Lucius Payne Freer. Now, he was a lawyer, but also really active on the Underground Railroad. He and his wife would hide people out in their own house pretty regularly, and was also a lawyer working for the cause. He and his partner, James Collins, were known to get involved in pretty much every anti-slavery case, and also just in the very important work of keeping up the anti-slavery cause in Chicago, making sure that it was not really socially acceptable not to be anti-slavery in Chicago. Certainly there are people who were, but downstate they referred to Chicago as a sinkhole of abolitionism. That was largely due to the efforts of people like LCP Freer. Now, in 1850, in fact, we'll probably get to this a little bit later, in 1850, there were 1860. at a time when the United States Marshal had been told that he would be held personally accountable if there were any fugitive slaves in Chicago who were not arrested. In response to this, they gathered everybody up, and L.C. Freer invited people out to his office, saying, "The new United States Marshal is inaugurating a reign of terror among our colored population. Do you wish to take any step in the matter? If you do, you are invited to my office this Friday evening at 7:30 at number 51 Clark Street. None but live men are invited." I love that last line. None but live men are invited. We'll get back to that in a little bit. I've got a whole bunch of articles about that story about the United States Marshal. It's wild and kind of hard to get your head around. I'm still trying to figure out all of the details of it, but that'll probably hit the Patreon pretty soon. Let's move on up here. Just across from Freer at Graceland is his law partner, James Collins. Now, James Collins I've never been able to find a picture of, which is kind of unusual since he was a pretty prominent lawyer at the time. I'm sure there are pictures out there. I just haven't found one yet. But he was known as a most violent abolitionist, even ran as a candidate for office on the third-party Liberty ticket that would accept nothing less than full abolition. Now, there was a time in the 1840s, 3 men were arrested as possible refugee enslaved people in Chicago. And they were brought to the jail, at which point Freer and Collins and a couple of their friends got together in front of Judge Kercheval. This became a really big deal at the time. There was a whole riot forming outside because of the work they had done, that when something like this happened in Chicago, the citizens would turn out in force. Freer and Collins talked to Judge Kercheval and managed to convince him that the person who had arrested these guys had no authority to do so in Illinois. By the time the judge decided to throw the whole thing out, they had already been hustled out to safety anyway. The next day, Collins had a letter out in the paper saying, "No officer, while engaged in the arrest, detention, or surrender of a fugitive slave, can claim any greater protection from the law than any private person who may be mean and vile enough to engage in such an employment. And any officer thus employed is entitled to the same respect, and no more, as should be given to the base and mercenary slave catcher." In other words, if you see a police officer in Chicago attempting to arrest somebody under the fugitive slave law, it is okay to shoot that cop because all they are doing is kidnapping. They did not have a right to do anything like that in Chicago, at least not in 1846. After the fugitive slave law a few years later, it would have been a little bit more debatable. But at the time, the police force in Chicago consisted of like 5 guys, one of whom was a guy by the name of Henry Rhines, who lived right about here, just about a block away from Dyer's office, and is presently at Graceland Cemetery. There is no picture of him either, but here's a picture of his son, which is probably pretty similar to how he looked. His son, Dump Rhines, was a great billiard player, very famous as a billiard man. But Henry, as a member of the police force, was engaged most of his time in arresting people that he thought might be escaping from slavery. Not even just people in Chicago. One time he went up to Wisconsin and did so. But then things get a little bit weird. There was a situation where he shot a bartender, was arrested for murder, then escaped and went down to New Orleans. By some manner or another, he was recaptured, but the judge ended up throwing out the case, or he got a pardon from the governor or something. I've got the data on it. I haven't sorted it all out yet. We're going to get to it. We have solved kind of the mystery of what happened with this guy. Because a couple of years later, he was back on the job assisting in some of these cases. But eventually he died of some disease. And now we do the hand jive on his grave. This dad just kind of went around and did dances on all the graves of the bad guys. But I was running out of moves by the time I got to this guy, so we just kind of did the hand jive. Another of the cases he was known to be involved in was one with the Great Western, that ship that I mentioned earlier that was only too happy just not to notice that they suddenly had a lot more black employees when they sailed away. There was a time when Rhines wasn't even with the police force at the time, but he came up to Captain Walker and said, "Captain Walker, are you aware of the fact that you have 3 fugitive slaves on board the ship?" And Captain Walker said, "Are you an officer of the law?" And Mr. Rhines said, "Well, no." And Captain Walker said, "Well, you're just a damned rascal then." and sailed away. While back on the shore, Philo Carpenter danced and cheered, along with a guy by the name of Louis Isbell, who had a barber shop right about here where the Thompson Center is now. At the time, this was the site of the old hotel, Sherman House Hotel, and there was the barber shop of a guy by the name of Louis Isbell. He would later claim to be the first black man in Chicago. He definitely was not, but that was a story he liked to tell a lot. Louis Isbell also said that Abraham Lincoln came up to him in the early 1860s during the Civil War, right after the Emancipation Proclamation, right after the United States started recruiting black soldiers to fight in the war. He said that Lincoln persuaded him personally to become a recruiter. By then, he was too old really to be a soldier, but he went to work recruiting more black men to fight for the Union. Now, we do know that, I don't know if Lincoln actually appointed him or not, but we do know that he was engaged in this. He was widely reported as such at the time, but that wasn't a job you could have officially with the military as a black man at the time. So later when he tried to get a pension for it, he was denied, though I really think that they really ought to give him a gravestone. He's unmarked down at Mount Olivet Cemetery. Yeah, this is one of the things, a squad of 33 enlisted by Isbell. 33 people. It's also estimated that he himself had helped somewhere in the range of 300 people escape from slavery, some number around that. It's difficult to know exactly how many of his stories are true and how many of them are just old man stories that he told later on. Certainly quite a bit of it we can verify. There's a great one. One time, Senator Douglas came and gave a big speech about expanding slavery into new territories, which in the process included an awful lot of racist stuff, and then had the nerve to go into Louis Isbell's barber shop for a haircut. And as the barber, he knew everybody. He knew Senator Douglas, always said that we were great friends, and did in fact tell him off that day when he came in for a haircut. Well, Douglas kind of walked in with his tail between his legs, according to him. We're up here in City Cemetery now, what is now Lincoln Park. If we look over here, there was a guy by the name of Moses Hunter who was buried somewhere in the old City Cemetery. He was an abolitionist professor who dressed in robes without seams, like he thought Jesus did, for reasons unclear. But he died while on vacation in Chicago. Only Dr. Dyer knew exactly where he was buried, but somewhere here in City Cemetery, and I don't think that he ever got moved. But this is a memorial boulder to a guy by the name of David Kennison. Now, David Kennison claimed that he was 115 years old and the last survivor of the Boston Tea Party. Clearly not a guy we should believe 100%. In fact, there's even a mention in his file saying, yeah, don't listen to a word this guy says. But he used his status at Free Soil meetings and anti-slavery meetings. After establishing that he was a hero, he would stand up and close with the words, "Make your country free and abolish slavery." Now, the guy may have been beefing up his credentials a bit. He may have been a con artist, but he was using his powers for good anyway. Right down here on State Street, right in the middle of what is now State Street, used to be one of our city halls. So I've kind of tried to get it as oriented as I could right here. This is about where it would have been. There was a number of city halls in the city over time. About 1850, it looked like this, right in the middle of State Street, getting in everybody's way. But 1850, things changed a lot. 1850, the Fugitive Slave Law was passed, requiring people in Illinois to arrest anybody that they thought was escaping. This included, you could no longer have laws saying that you were just a sanctuary city. But a meeting was held here at City Hall in which they decided, no, we're not going to make the police go along with this. Collins got up and made a very big speech about this, took his stand in the middle of hall and explained, "All temporal honor and glory to the Common Council of Chicago, political death and damnation to the base bad men who aided in the passage of this infernal law or who cowardly sneaked away from the vote on its final passage." Thereafter, there was a meeting of what was called the Colored Citizens of Chicago, who said, "Resolve that in the language of the father of his country, General Washington, resistance to tyrants is obedience to God, that we will stand by our liberty at the expense of our lives and will not consent to be taken into slavery, nor permit our brethren to be taken." Very good lines. was also right about in this vicinity, about 8 years later, Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln. They didn't have a specific Lincoln-Douglas debate in Chicago, but there was a time when Douglas gave a speech one day and then Lincoln gave a speech the next. It was right around the same time period, and they said pretty much the same stuff. That would have been at the old Tremont House, right across the street from this, really, or down around the corner. We'll move on to Michigan Avenue for a bit, another place that would have been considered a stop on the Underground Railroad, right where the CVS is now. This was the home of George Manier, along with his wife Anne Manier. Fantastic dress that she had there. Now, George Manier got his start as a poet in New York, or at least he tried to. Then eventually he came back to Chicago and worked as a lawyer and got deeply involved in the abolitionist cause. See what it says here. So there was a thing in 1851, shortly after the fugitive slave law, that a guy by the name of Moses Johnson was arrested as a possible fugitive. George Manier was the guy who took up the case. There were also this attracted a wide amount of citizen kidnappers, citizen arrested under the fugitive slave law. So a trial was held in the saloon building. And Moses Johnson himself was actually kept locked up in one of the rooms in this place, but he was guarded by a drunken guard. I'm guessing it was Henry Rhines. I know he was involved in this case. But there was a story that came out a couple of days later saying that while he was under guard, the guard got drunk and instead started guarding the building next door, which was private apartments. A guy came stumbling home to his apartment, and the guard, probably Rhines, pulled out a gun and said, "What's the password?" The password was Fillmore. The guy said, I don't need a password. This is my apartment. And the guard said, "No, everybody needs a password. If you don't tell me the password, I'm going to shoot you." And the guy said, "Okay, what's the password?" And the guard said, "It's Fillmore." And the guy said, "Okay, Fillmore." Then walked right through. It's just so much like a Bugs Bunny cartoon, it's difficult to know whether to consider it real or not. But Manier, as the lawyer in the case, found a loophole in the law. He was able to get Moses Johnson an actual trial himself and brought him before the jury and said, "Now, here we have this warrant for a copper-colored man named Moses Johnson. Now, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is Moses Johnson, who stands accused of being the self-same Moses Johnson. Would you describe this man as copper-colored?" There then came a full-day debate on exactly how Moses Johnson should have been described, which was itself problematic and dehumanizing, but it worked. The jury ruled that he did not match up the description of the man in the warrant and therefore could not be the right person and was free to go. And this was quite a blow. Under the fugitive slave law, a person down south could come up to Chicago, see a black man with a scar on his forehead, then go back down south and say, "I had a slave escape from me, he had a scar on his forehead," then go to Chicago with the warrant and arrest that guy and take him into slavery. Manier ended up, spent several years doing that before becoming a judge. After that, he was a little less active in the cause. He kind of had to be as a judge, but continued contributing money towards it. If they needed money to get somebody out of town, they could always go to Judge Manier. We'll also cover what we're talking about Stephen Douglas a second ago. Right where the courthouse is now is the old market hall. We'll block this off. At the old market hall in 1854, Stephen Douglas came to town and said, and just to promote his new Kansas-Nebraska Act. Before that, we've been living under what some people call the Missouri Compromise, but is better described as the Missouri Capitulation, where they decided that henceforth there would still be slave states and free states. It would just be divided by the southern border of Missouri. 1854, Stephen Douglas introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Bill, which said henceforth any new territories that are about to become states like Kansas or Nebraska can vote on whether or not they want slavery. Perhaps not guessing that full militias would form to make sure they became slavery by any means necessary. There's a case here. When he tried to give a speech about it here at Market Square, where the courthouse is now, people came, as you can see. They became too noisy, threw rotten eggs, chips, and other things at the Little Giant. The cast was turned off, and nearly everybody got another man's hat. In the affair that followed, a guy by the name of Ike Cook, a local politician, said, "Truth squashed to earth will rise again," which is a great line, except the truth he was talking about was slavery. Douglas just got up there and saying, "You're all threatening to kill me. You're all disorderly. You're all being really intolerant here." Always with that. We'll move on a bit. Over at Graceland Cemetery, we'll cover again is the grave of John and Mary Richardson Jones. Now, John Jones was the first black man to get rich in Chicago. Show a quick picture of the two of them here. We'll show it again in a second. I'm going to show where they live for a second. They lived at Plymouth and 9th. And also had a tailor shop on Dearborn. Now, John had come to town and started working as a tailor and cleaner, got really relatively rich doing it, built a very large house for himself and his wife and his family, which was definitely known to be an Underground Railroad stop. People were hiding out in the place pretty regularly. John himself, one of the weird things, he got together with LCP Freer and actually bought a person to get his freedom one time. Actually filled out a thing transferring ownership over to John Jones, though in the same document they also freed the guy. By some accounts, I can't tell for sure, but I think this might have been Mary, his wife's brother-in-law or brother. Here are John and Mary Richardson Jones. Now really, when we see things like the Colored Citizens Council, almost the first act of the meeting was generally his nephew saying, "I move to make John Jones the president of the organization." One thing, Mary outlived John considerably. The story she had to tell over and over again was the day that John Brown showed up at the house. Now, John Brown had been there before. He and Frederick Douglass swung by one time. Then one day, after John Brown became the radical abolitionist who was plotting a slave uprising to end slavery all by himself, one day he and a bunch of his fighters showed up. And Mary would later say that she wasn't sure she wanted these guys in his house. They looked like the toughest bunch of guys she had ever seen. But John said, "Well, what are we supposed to do? Hide them out for a minute. I'll go gather up some money." They went to people like George Manier to get money to get these guys to Canada. And so she let them in, found a guy who looked about like John's size and sent him to State Street to get fitted for a new coat, which she believed was the jacket that John Brown was later wearing when he was hanged after his attempt at Harper's Ferry. That was the story. She outlived John considerably, told that story over and over and over again. Couple quick others here. We'll also just briefly cover Allan Pinkerton, who has a rather mixed legacy in Chicago, but initially came to Chicago specifically to work on the Underground Railroad. They referred to him as the indefatigable Allan Pinkerton of Gurnee at the time. It's been so long since I did this one. This one is actually marked now. It was unmarked when I filmed it. But on the left here is a guy by the name of Seth Payne, who was an abolitionist and a spiritualist, and a feminist and a vegetarian long before those things became popular to be. So this is him when he was working with Pinkerton at Antietam during the Civil War. Now, previously, he was known for having worked a lot on the Underground Railroad. In fact, there's the remains of a building he had out in Lake Zurich even now that they think is full of hiding places, possibly for use on the Underground Railroad. But I love talking about this guy. One newspaper of his day referred to him as a queer chicken. And, of course, some of my best friends are queer chickens. Seth Payne was also a spiritualist, opened a spiritualist bank that was operated in such a way that when somebody wanted a loan, they could ask the ghost of Alexander Hamilton if he was a good loan candidate. Interesting guy in any case. His gravestone has now been marked. It got marked about a year ago now. I'm just about over time, so we're going to stick over in Graceland Cemetery. There's one story in particular I wanted to get through is right about where we're standing here, right behind Eternal Silence, is the grave of a guy by the name of Henry Harris that I always feel like I ought to bring up as often as possible. In 1867, Henry Harris had been in Chicago for about 5 years, came up from North Carolina, probably escaping slavery given the timeline. So, 1867, he was having his fortune read when the police raided the fortune-telling parlor. He was not wanted for anything, but he instinctively started running. At one point, a police officer, Officer Reuben Slayton, just caught up with him and beat him so badly that, despite the fact that he was surrendering and going peacefully, beaten so badly that he died in jail that night. And this brought up articles even back at the time. We have, there are any number of articles about police brutality from the 1850s, the 1860s. This is by no means a new issue. In fact, the Graceland Interment book specifically gives his cause of death as brutality of policemen. Now, elsewhere in this section are graves that we're working on getting marked. I really want a marker for Henry Harris. We're working on a couple others as well. This is a picture of the John Brown Post of the Grand Army of the Republic, a Black Civil War veterans group here in Chicago, which probably included a couple of guys who are buried here named William Gill and Horace Jackson. These were men who fought with the 116th. They had both left slavery in Kentucky. There was a new rule. Kentucky was a border state. It was still a slave state, but it hadn't joined the Confederacy. A new rule had come up saying that the Union would compensate enslavers up to $300 per person if they let the people they enslaved go and join the army. Though a lot of them would take the money and then kidnap people right back into slavery. But in Horace Jackson's file, there is actually this piece of paper, the claim for the compensation of Horace Jackson. It drives me nuts looking at this. But they both fought in the 116th, which ended up fighting alongside the 29th, which was the unit from Illinois and Chicago. After the war, they both drifted to Chicago. And yeah, well, these stories just keep on coming up all the way through here. One other person to cover. Let's pop over to Rose Hill for a second. Most of the big abolitionist graves in Chicago are really at Graceland Cemetery, partly because the founder, Thomas Barber Bryan, was an anti-slavery man himself. Bought the handwritten draft of the Emancipation Proclamation from Abraham Lincoln. And we just check out these deer for a second. I couldn't resist filming the deer. But over behind the deer, I will eventually get to Eliza Chappell Porter, who was Chicago's first school teacher, subject of a lengthy biography written by her mother. And it does recount the time when they were up around Milwaukee. A few people came in and said, hey, we've got some people who are escaping up to Canada. Can you hide them out for a couple of days until the ship comes? And they agreed to do it, but then the ship was late. They had to hide them in the church for a little while until the ship finally came. We don't have enough details about this. Her daughter wrote that there were so many interesting incidents associated with this that she laughed just thinking about them. Then instead of relating what those incidents were, she went right back into talking about how pious her mother was, as often was the case at the time. But all right, I am a bit over time and starting to run out of my voice, so we're going to go ahead and plug some of the upcoming stuff. Sunday morning, our next tour is going to be a virtual ghost tour. And next week, next Wednesday, we're still doing Wednesdays, so everybody can tune into the Chicago for Chicagoans lectures at the Chicago for Chicagoans page, or right out at room 13. Tomorrow next week, we'll be talking about Was the Wrong Man Hanged? This is a whole new presentation for me. There are any number of stories in the archives where a man was hanged in Chicago, and there was strong evidence that they might have had the wrong guy or that the whole investigation had been botched. In fact, it's kind of hard to find cases where that wasn't the situation. So we'll examine some of these. This is a brand new presentation that I've been thinking about doing for a long time. I will finally put it together over the course of the next week or so. So everybody, thanks a lot for joining me. I'm Adam from Mysterious Chicago. Thanks to everybody who has still been kicking in contributions or joining the Patreon. That's the best thing you can do is join the Patreon, really. But until then, everybody, we'll put the Benny Goodman back on and just hang out a bit. Thanks, Heather. Guys, I am so sleepy. I don't know why. Laura, I am drinking some bourbon tonight. Oh, Tom, that sounds cool. Yeah, Bob, it was a pretty long day. It's been a long day. Thanks, Maria. Thanks, Diane. Sazerac. That's probably what I'll be drinking tomorrow night. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Steve. How many people were wrongly hanged? There's no way of knowing. There are a couple of cases where somebody else later confessed to the crime, but never a case where we know for sure they were telling the truth. Do I know what a handwritten copy of Emancipation Proclamation is now? I don't. I know there's a copy of it at the Freedom Museum, the Underground Railroad Museum in Cincinnati. I think that's the document they have there. Don't quote me on that. I have to double check that it wasn't like a draft of the 13th. But there were a couple of handwritten drafts. The one that Brian bought might have burned up in the Great Chicago Fire. But he had sold a number of copies of it to raise money for a soldier's home. Sherry, any information about the Underground Railroad stops north and west of Cook County? Difficult to say. There's a bit of a trick with it is that we tend to think of places as stops, but that's really a little bit more formal than it actually was. Now, most of the time, they were really just kind of improvising. Now, tomorrow night, Patty Swanson is giving the lecture at Chicago for Chicagoans in Room 13. Next Thursday, Mandy Crypt is. And then the week after that, it'll be me. That'll be on the 16th. Will be my talk for Chicagoans. I don't think they put the tickets up yet, but they will soon. That is also going to be the day, February 16th, is the day that I officially become older than Elvis lived to be. I will be talking about long-lost vice districts in Chicago. We all know about the Levee District, but there were lots of other vice districts. Mandy will be covering the Levee next week, so I guess tickets for mine go up tomorrow. Yeah, that'll be the first in-person, well, it's actually not the first in-person event of the year. On Saturday, I will be in Glen Ellen, giving a talk about grave robbing, as I do. I should really put that one together tomorrow. Oh, I still got Friday, too. I can procrastinate another day, because this is Wednesday. It never feels like Wednesday when I'm doing a Wednesday night version of the tour. What's glowing in my fireplace? My fake fire. And now that it would be time for Miles to come hang out, he stopped bothering me. After driving me crazy all day.
Ellen Ward sings once more. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo.
Susan, no, it does not have heat. You guys, that's been there the whole time, you know. It's within about the first few weeks of me doing virtual tours, it has been there. Oh, Megan, that's cool. Yeah, finding places that we can actually confirm, not just anecdotal evidence suggest, is pretty unusual. It's not as bad as, like, Al Capone was here stories. Well, it was better than them. I'd much rather claim my building was an Underground Railroad style than an Al Capone hangout. It may show more because there's so much mess in the apartment right now that you might just be looking at it more. That could very well be. If he hollers, let it go, let it fly away. Any time of day. Hey, Katie. Say hi to John for us. Even Mr. Crosby sings it. North, the cats are doing fine. Miles was driving me nuts for the last couple hours, but now that the tour is over, he's nowhere to be seen. Thanks for singing with me, Kendra. Let's see if I can find Miles anyway. Miles?
Benny Goodman's orchestra and the King Porter's Stomp.
Miles. I think he wore himself out at the beginning there. Yeah, Talk Frill. You know, I see the comments on this one when I get back. Now, when people leave comments while watching the tour later, I'm never going to see that. Just to be able to see what you put in a comment that came in after the tour ended is majorly a pain in the butt. But all the time, like, there'll be another comment in the middle of the night or a day or two later. I'm never going to see that. Thanks, Lynn. Carol, we do occasionally do virtual tours in other places. We were just in Minnesota about a week or two ago. And we got some Georgia runs coming up and some New York runs coming up as well. Happy birthday again, Susan. The Platt House, I imagine, would be. There's a couple around the vicinity where the house isn't there anymore, but we know there was stuff going on there. Yeah, Jeff, we did the Iowa City Cemetery. It's probably been about 2 years now since we did that, but we did it. We've done cemeteries in New York, cemeteries in Ohio, cemeteries in Iowa, cemeteries in Indiana, Georgia. Did we do Florida? We might have done Florida. No, I don't think we've done Florida. I don't stick around in Florida long enough. Thanks, Gene. I gotta start having more caffeine midday, folks. I really do. My lack of sleep lately is kind of catching up with me.
Rhythm was presented by the Raja Rhythm. Benny Goodman and his orchestra.
Yeah, the Dark Angel is in Iowa City.
Of the Congress Hotel in downtown Chicago.
There might be another Dark Angel in Davenport.
Broadcasting Company.
There was one in Moline, elsewhere in the Quad Cities. All right, that's Benny wrapping up. I think that's my cue to wrap up as well. I am awfully tired today. But everybody, thanks a lot for joining me. I'm Adam from Mysterious Chicago Tours, telling everybody to stay safe and stay strong. And of course, if you can, ladies and gentlemen, hey Faith, I'm gonna go check out the Springsteen set list. And I will see you all tomorrow morning for another morning mini tours. I'm used to saying see you tomorrow for Find a Grave Friday. Tomorrow will just be a regular morning mini tour, but we'll pick out something cool to do. So talk to everybody tomorrow. I'm Adam from Mysterious Chicago Tours, telling everybody to stay safe and stay strong. And of course, if you can,